Okay, hi guys. I'm really struggling for focus actually on this video today. If one thing isn't happening, I keep getting distracted by the slightly Einsteinian look of my hair, which is basically, it's not because, well, I mean, I do know that there's no way in which I could approximate Albert Einstein intellectually, and the old bar lead is perhaps the only way I could do it, but it's not a deliberate attempt on my part. It's just a bad hair day amongst a bad hair lifetime that I've had so far. But then I got halfway through this video and the fucking sun came. I like the sun, would be shafted without it, but if you can see here, if you can see the sun, I mean it's the big, if you're not familiar with it, it's the big glowy red ball thing that's out there, and it was right in the face. I don't like it right in the face like that. Anyway, so on with the video, if I can just adjust that. So I hope you'll find this interesting. If you've been following the EvoSight discussions, it's very relevant to that, but probably the lines upon which people will be divided on this won't be the lines of pro and anti-EvoSight. There'll be people on both sides, from both sides. I want to look at the old chestnut itself. It's the nurture versus nature. Where does the balance lie? It's a question somebody's asked everybody this, and we've all asked ourselves this one. And I wanted to just frame it in the context of a particular example to give you my answer, or rather to give you my non-answer. I'm not going to discuss evidence for nurture and nature. So whatever baggage you've got from the EvoSight debate, you can dismount that baggage and set it to one side. I want to look at this from a philosophical perspective of just asking, is this a reasonable question to ask in the first place? So how I want to do that, how I'm going to go about that, is to look at an example that's quite often given, and it's an example that in the first instance is generally given by people who are, you would say, anti-EvoSight or anti-Evo, the idea that there are evolutionary or biological explanations for our behaviour, for our practices, and for any of our customs or behaviours. So the example that's sometimes given is using a knife and fork, because it's a kind of trivialising example, isn't it? The example is something along the lines of, oh, so you're saying that the reason that we eat with a knife and fork is because there's a gene for eating with a knife and fork. Obviously, it's a ridiculous thing to suggest. Nobody would possibly suggest that in Europe that we all have a gene for eating with a knife and fork, whereas in sort of Eastern Asia they have a gene for eating with chopsticks or whatever. We can understand why it's a good mocking example to use, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed here and hoping that everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet as me on this, and that we all accept that this is not an innate behaviour. By the way, I don't want to use the terms nurture and nature, because I find the term nurture confusing, because nurture subsumes, does it not, all learned behaviours, and we can't necessarily assume that anything that's learned couldn't have a biological component, because after all we learn things from our parents. And if our behaviours, if we accept the possibility, which we have to study this balance in the first place, if we accept the possibility that our behaviours could be predisposed and affected by biological factors, then that could include our parenting behaviours. So it could be that certain ways in which parents, perhaps slight differences in treatment of boys and girls, might not necessarily be due to cultural prejudices and specifics, but could be innately biological in and of themselves. So to just remove that possibility from the equation, that little confounding factor, perhaps we should talk about innately disposed things and culturally disposed factors. That's what I'm going to try and use for the rest of this. So we're talking about this knife and fork example, and I'm hoping we all agree that looking on that kind of level of comparing knife and fork usage to chopstick usage, etc., that most people would say, no, that's an entirely culturally disposed behaviour, and I think we would all be happy with that. But I would like you to think about the question again of using a knife and fork, and this is what I propose to you, that in actual fact there's only really two ways of eating for a mammal, And that consists of these two. It consists of either mashing your face into the food and going nom nom nom, in the way if you have a pet, a cat or a dog, that's the way that they will eat. In fact, it's the way that most mammals eat. And the alternative to that is to actually move the food to your mouth. You either move your mouth to the food or you move the food to your mouth using your hands or your limbs in some kind of way. If you have a pet hamster, they do a little bit of both. Primates predominantly, almost exclusively I think, tend to move the food to their mouth rather than the mouth to their food. I would also propose to you that the usage of a knife and fork, really when you think about it qualitatively, is no different from using your hands to move the food to your mouth. You're performing the same actions. What do you do with your hands? Well, you'll pull food apart into edible sized chunks, and then you will pick the food up and move it to your mouth. Isn't that exactly what you're doing with a knife and fork? Isn't a knife and fork just a useful extension of that feature? We use the knife to dissect the food into usable chunks, and then the fork to pick the food up, basically without getting gravy and shit on our fingers, is basically what's going on there, and to move the food to our mouths. So what I'm suggesting to you is, if we just look at eating with a knife and fork as another version of eating with our hands, and I'm going to cross my fingers here again and say that I hope that most people in here would agree with me that eating with your hands rather than eating by mashing your face into the food as a cat and dog does is an innately disposed behaviour. And after all, you know, if it isn't, then what does that mean? If you look at all the primates, if you're looking at these gibbons and all the, not just baboons, but each individual troop of baboon, each individual group of capuchin monkeys, each group of great apes, all of them would have had to have arrived one way or another at the same cultural aspect, because they're all doing the same thing. The mind boggles how that could have arisen was if there is not some distinct innate disposition amongst primates to eat by moving the food to their mouths using their hands. So I would hope, in just the same way as when we looked at the specific case of eating with a knife and fork as opposed to chopsticks, we'd all be in agreement that this was a culturally disposed behaviour. I hope when we think about actually just eating with our hands and moving the food to our mouths, we'd all equally agree, without having to evidence it in any specific way through some incredibly difficult set of experiments that people would disagree with in any event, that this is an innately disposed behaviour amongst primates, including ourselves. After all, when you see a baby, what's the first thing they do when they grab hold of things? They jam it in their mouths, don't they? That's not something that we need to teach them. In fact, it's something we actually try and dissuade them from doing for their own safety and benefit. So this is the thing then, I've laid out the example, and so this is why when people ask about nurture versus nature, where does the balance lie, even taking away all the myriad different types of behaviour and saying, well, which types of behaviour will we rate over which other types of behaviour, even when we look at just one specific example of behaviour in isolation, it's apparent that it very much depends upon which level of the behaviour we choose to rate more highly than which other level of the behaviour as to where we're going to place the balance. If we talk about eating with a knife and fork, if we view it as eating with a knife and fork as opposed to eating with a set of chopsticks, then the conclusion that we would draw is that it's a culturally disposed behaviour, almost, if not entirely, in its entirety. Whereas if we think about, well, eating with a knife and fork is really just an extension of eating with our hands, then the conclusion most of us would draw is that this is an almost entirely, if not entirely, innately disposed behaviour. The point I want to make with this is that this whole question of nurture versus nature, of innate versus culturally disposed behaviours, to try and put any kind of a figure on it, to try and arrive at any kind of an answer, is a fool's game in and of itself. The only way to look at these things is on a much more individual level, not necessarily on each individual behaviour, but on each individual type of behaviour. Talk about what level that we're trying to describe, and maybe then we could give a figure. That's about all I wanted to say on this. It's nice to talk about something where I'm not having to grizzle and moan at the webcam. Okay, thank you for watching. And by the way, new webcam coming in the new year, so you see every little imperfection on my face, or at least you would if there were any. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.